this series later on this evening with a sort of grand finale. Then hence my thank you right at the beginning. And also right at the beginning, very selfishly, I would like to draw your attention to another lecture that I'm giving next week for another platform. It is at the German Archaeological Institute. It has organized a double lecture by Mark Garrison, my colleague from San Antonio, Texas, and myself. And it will be about the genesis of early Persian identity and early Persian religion as visible in the archives from Persepolis. So we will talk in a sort of, we hope we will talk in a very lively way. So not two lectures, but we sort of interrupt each other all the time. It's free for everybody, and there's wine afterwards. So I hope you will all come. So, okay, after this, we return to our beloved blue forest that I have introduced to you last week as an image of a sort of pristine world in which people started to move and started to spread stories, the mental DNA that we still carry in us. And I've read at the end of last week's session a poem by the Dutch poet Lune about this pristine state and a sort of longing to that origin. Last week has been about origins. We have talked about pan-babylonist, the movement that wanted to show that Mesopotamian myths are the origin of all literature and maybe even of all culture. And we have talked about the birth of the hero, including Gilgamesh, who is himself subject of one of those birth legends. Today we have a more grim task, I'm afraid, and I kept it for the last, obviously. We will have to talk about death. 2 hours about death. It's of course a daunting prospect, but I assure you it will be very dramatic and maybe even interesting. So, what did I do last week? I showed you the recent excavations of this incredible site in Turkey, Göbekli Tepe, where there are remains from about 9000 BC. It's really absolutely incredible. Monumental structures showing a world of maybe divinities or superhuman creatures, symbolized in these abstract pillars with arms, and also a world of animals, a world of hunters who came there to sacrifice but didn't live there because settlements didn't exist. These hunters, they roamed around, but they had this one meeting place where maybe they had festivals once or twice a year and where they met from larger regions. And then they spread again and carried with them their stories. So I've used this as one example, but of course there are many others in Europe and also in the ancient Near East. And we have talked, staying with the theme of the hunter in the forest, about this ancient tale, the hunter taboo, of a hunter who is lured into the magic forest. He wants to shoot a deer, he wants to catch something because he's a hunter, and a deer presents itself to him. And because of this, he's lured deeper into the forest, and he falls into the arms of this destructive goddess who lives in the forest. To sleep with her is deadly, but to refuse it is also deadly. And these stories are surely very, very ancient. They belong to the deepest layers of our mental DNA. And I can be certain about that because these stories are spread all over the ancient world, which is an area that I defined as stretching from Iceland to northern India and from deep into Central Asia to North Africa. So it is, in the end, a limited area, but it is also a vast area. That it is a limited area shows that these are cultural constructs. They are not in any way genetic. It's not that all human brains have these stories naturally, that you are born with it, but they are a cultural given phenomenon that is traded down generation by generation. So this was an interesting example, I think, about the spread of stories. And as I said, the pan-Babylonians which were a group of German scholars around 1900, 1910, they were of course not the first to observe this, that you have all these stories that are related and that you can sometimes find an origin for them in antiquity, but they were the first to make, say, a philosophical point about it. They said, if it is true that the oldest versions of the stories that we know come from the Near East, from the Orient, maybe we should allow for the theory that everything comes ultimately from Mesopotamia, and by everything we don't mean a great selection of stories, but we mean the original inspiration of literature, and that original inspiration is divine. It is a divine revelation that is, in the first place, visible in the stars. Because human mythology is a reflection of the constellations in the sky, of the movements, of the planets, of the sun and the moon, and combinations thereof. And that is a kind of divine revelation which was understood first by the Babylonians, recorded in its most pure and divine form by the Babylonians, and then spread via, for instance, the Hebrew mythological systems, the Greek mythological system to Europe, but also to North Africa and to the, for instance, the modern Near East. So they derived everything from that. So this is the first pillar of pan-Babylonism. We call that diffusionism. That means that stories are spread from one single source. But they had a second hypothesis, and that is that the ancient world as such is a cultural unity. There are no real intellectual borders between ancient Greece and, for instance, ancient Persia, or between Assyrian cultures and Roman cultures. It's one big cultural continuum in which, of course, a lot of variation and local difference exists, but basically this is one world. It's not different worlds. So they actually did what Said told us, not to think in East and West. They saw everything as unity then already, a century before Said. And this is their universalist approach. And this is actually the most interesting part of their thinking, and maybe also the reason why I think that pan-Babylonism has now, today as we speak, not really reached the aim of its project. Because its aim is a universalist approach to literature and to culture. And they somehow stopped before really reaching that goal. And as I told you, that is a tragic story, an event in which their teacher, Friedrich Delitzsch, played a big role. He didn't speak out about pan-Babylonism, and he was urged and urged again by his pupils, and in the end he did give a series of lectures in which he did show that, for instance, the Old Testament derives from older Babylonian mythology, but he went further. He started to introduce anti-Semite elements in his lectures, saying that the Jews had sort of deteriorated those originally pure mythologies, and that we should purify the Old and the New Testament. And he went on, and his last book, as I said last week, is a purely anti-Semite work, which is quite vicious if you read it nowadays. And this has put the whole pan-Babylonian movement in a very bad light. After 1904, 1905, the interest of the public dwindled. They kept going on, but the big problem is that one of the most important scholars in their group, Hugo Winkler, died in 1913, and with his death and the negative publicity and the advent of the First World War, the movement was really dead, it was over. Except for one person who had been isolated, even within the group of pan-Babylonists all the time, Peter Jensen, and who kept going on as if nothing had happened. And he has written a series of publications, and they are a bit different from what the other scholars thought. So he doesn't take Babylonian mythology or or if necessary, the stars as the origin of everything, he focuses on one work, one single myth, and that is the Gilgamesh epic. He derives the entire world's mythology, or I should say from the ancient world, from the Gilgamesh epic. He sees Gilgamesh as the absolute beginning, the absolute divine origin. And I should stress this again and again, as I tried to show last week. These people, they were in other parts of their work, they were really great scholars. They had good names. They published about languages like Elamite and Akkadian and Hebrew, and they were very good in it. They were absolutely acknowledged in their time. But when they were speaking about these things, they had no limits whatsoever. And this is because this for them is not really scholarship anymore. It is an alternative religion. They really believed in it. And if you believe in something, even the most superficial parallel becomes meaningful, because it is a part of your belief. And you recognize this divine inspiration again, and again, even if the parallels are not so straightforward. So, he, for instance, explained the life of Jesus as a version of the Gilgamesh epic. So, and as you can imagine, this didn't give him many fans in those days. But he kept going on. Long after the days of pan-babylonism, after the First World War, he published the second volume of Das Gilgamesh-Epos in der Weltliteratur. And I must say, it's 1,000 pages. There's a lot of very superficial comparison in it, but there are also some really good ideas in it, and they are completely forgotten. Nobody ever reads his works. I mean, it's almost forbidden to cite him in my fields, and it's a pity. It's a pity not only for the content, but also for the idealism that he had. He was, I think, in the end, the only real universalist among the pan-babylonist scholars. And he writes that in the introduction of his second volume, as I quoted him last time, that he says, of course there will be critics, and they say, you cannot make these easy comparisons between a Babylonian and a Greek myth, or a Hebrew and a Germanic myth, and you are much too easy, and you should stick to your own field and your own specialization. And then he answers these critics and he says, but I smile when I hear them talk like that, because I will fly over beautiful landscapes while they stay at home in their agony. Ich aber würde mich dabei heiteren Anlitzes der Fantasie freuen, der Göttertochter, die über hohe Bergen hinwegschweben und neue Länder und Meere entdecken darf, während die biedere Vernunft griesgrämig und tatenlos zu Hause bleiben muss. And I think if you say something like that in these words, it means that you are first and foremost talking about literature and about a very personal perception of literature, which is almost religious. I mean, he admits it himself. And if you read the book in that way, then I think it makes much more sense. And as I've said, this is also why I think that if you put this really to literature, it works much better, because at the outset it was always a literary project. And this has been understood, I think, very well by Thomas Mann, who in Joseph und seine Brüder, the first part, die Geschichte Jakobs, introduces the depths of narrative history by his famous first line, Tief ist der Brunnen der Vergangenheit. Sollte man ihn nicht unergründlich nennen. Now this source of stories is explored by Mann in a way that is absolutely, you can hardly follow him. I mean, it's such a dazzling universe of stories that he gives you. But it is especially convincing, I think, that he gives us personality after personality that live the same lives because they live the same stories. And they're sort of half aware of the facts that they are living stories rather than individual lives. And they're half aware of another theater that stands behind them, and a theater that stands behind that theater, back to the earliest origin, which also with Thomas Mann is divine. And as I said, I think as literature this works really well. And it's of course not a theme that has not been picked up by other authors. There's for instance a recent book by Salman Rushdie, Harun and the Sea of Stories, that works on the same principle. It is also the idea, I think, that Goethe launched when he talked about Weltliteratur, as we saw last time, which for him was not an easy way to study literature in general, but to connect cultures really and to understand other cultures. So I think in this idea of a Brunnen der Vergangenheit, from which all these stories come, as an intellectual outset, comes a great promise. But can Gilgamesh be that promise? Can he be the origin? After all, Gilgamesh is quite exceptional, even in Mesopotamian context. Gilgamesh is about love and death, about one quite individual hero. So it is actually, if you think of it, what Jensen was trying to do is quite adventurous. That he tried to take this theme and explain world mythology, our dreams, our mental DNA from this one and single source. It is really quite brave what he was doing. So we will see today whether this works or not. Let me say at the outset that I think that it works in a certain way. And I think that it works in a way that answers some of the most fundamental questions that Said asks in Orientalism, whether we can really engage in the other. I think the spirit of Gilgamesh really helps us do that. And I think that is the essential importance of this single composition, this ridiculously unique composition. So in that sense, I really believe that Jensen was on the track of something really important, and I think that also explains why he went on doing this, even against the tide of his time, even in 1928. And think of it, 1928, the skies of Europe become darker already. And he knows this, and he presents his second volume as an alternative to nationalism. He talks about a Weltgeschichte des Märchens. So he sees an alternative vision of the world in folktales, in stories. So we are really talking about great things here. We are not talking about a madman who was in love with this one poem that he happened to know. There is really something intellectual at stake here. So, let's see what we can do with this. I made you listen to this music last time. This is Liebestod by Richard Wagner from Tristan und Sollte. And this is the version for piano made by Franz Liszt. And I will make you listen to this again at the end of my last lecture. And the reason for that is actually I should say the reason for this has only become clear to me today. I knew all the time that it would end with this music because I was hearing it all the time as I was writing these lectures. But today it occurred to me why this music in particular is important for our theme. So we will come back to this in the end. But first, something different. Of course, I'm aware that if I'm going to follow Jensen, I have quite a difficult task, because first of all I have to convince you that stories do travel, and more than you think, more than most of you in this audience are probably used to. So let me give you an example. This is one of the earliest editions of the story about Reinaard. In Dutch it's called Van den Vos Reinaarde. That means literally about the fox Reinaard. And it's a story about a sort of small criminal character, a fox, in a series of fables that otherwise includes a king, King Noble, and his wife, and a court of all kinds of animals. And the fox is quite hated by some of these animals, but mainly by the wolf, who is his big rival, and the bear, who is his greatest enemy. Now we have from Sumeria, that is the oldest culture of Mesopotamia, from the late 3rd millennium BC, that is, to make it completely clear to you, from 3000 to 2000 BC, really very old, we have a series of stories about the fox, in which he has a rival, which is also a wolf, and he has an enemy, who is not a bear but a dog. And there again, there is a lion who acts as a king and who has a court, and he's also, in this story, a kind of judge. And the story goes in the same way that the fox is finally called to court to face justice, but he manages to convince the king, the lion, that his accusers actually are the ones who should be punished, and he manages to escape, and he ends by posing as a pilgrim, as he does here, going to Rome in the Dutch version to get pardoned by the Pope. And in the Sumerian tale, he goes to sacrifice in the holy city of Nippur, which was the Vatican of the Sumerian state. Now, this is of course incredible because Van den Vos Reinaarde is from about 1200 in the Common Era. And the Sumerian tales are at least 2,200 years before the Common Era. So we are talking about more than 3,000 years of difference. And yet the central plots of these stories is really exactly the same. And this is absolutely amazing, of course. How can something like this happen? Well, we have an inkling. We know that a whole collection of fables from Mesopotamia, maybe via Achaemenid Persia, traveled to India quite early on. And they were translated there and are known today as the Panchatantra. And these again were translated back into Middle Persian, into Pahlavi, and from there they were translated into Arabic, where they are known as Vadimna, and also in Syriac, and from there they reached probably via Spain, Europe again. And the first, by coincidence, version that we have is the Dutch version, but there are also French and English and German versions. So we can trace this. It's actually, for people who work in this field, it's not so strange that you have these things, but I know that it is not generally known that we have these quite strong lines. So the spread of stories is a fact. It's a datum. We really have these things. Another example. And again, we need some music with it. And this is actually a quite important theme, because it relates to what I'm going to say about Gilgamesh and also about King Alexander. One of the oldest dreams, of course, that occurs in many fairy tales is the dream of flying, of having the ability to reach the skies. I think the origin of wanting to fly is not so much flying, but to reach the skies. It's a version of building the Tower of Babylon, of course. Now we have one story that goes as follows. I won't tell you from where, I will tell you later. A king is selected as a shepherd for his people by the gods and installed in his city. Then the focus shifts to outside the city. There's a tree with a snake and an eagle, and they have a bond. They look after each other's children. The eagle, however, is not loyal, and he eats one day, when he's hungry, the children of the snake. And the snake is weeping, and he calls for the assistance of the sun god. He helps him to take his revenge on the eagle, who is badly injured. He loses all his feathers. He sits in a pit, and then the king comes by, who doesn't have a son and cannot get a son. And the eagle promises, if you take care of me, which the king does, and the eagle grows new feathers, if you do that, I will bring you to heaven. And there you will find the Earl of of childhood, so that your wife will have a son, and you will have a name, and a name means eternity. So they do. He flies on the back of the eagle, and he looks back 3 times when he is in the skies. And the earth and the surrounding ocean, they become smaller and smaller until he doesn't see them again. They are represented as round objects, for instance, a field with a ditch around it, or a bucket of water with a rim, and then there's nothing. And the king becomes afraid, and they plunge back to earth, and there is no success in this attempt. Apparently then there's a second, and here the text is not preserved, so we don't know how it ended. But it seems that the flight was unsuccessful after all. Maybe he did receive the herb from heaven, but lost it in the last moment, which is quite typical for this kind of stories. Now, I want to present to you, before I continue, another story. There is a war between the birds and the other animals, the 4-footed animals. And in this war, the eagle plays a dominant role. And the eagle gets badly uninjured in this war, and he sits without feathers on a branch in a forest. A hunter comes, there's the hunter again, and he aims his bow at the eagle, but the eagle talks to him and says, "If you help me, I will fly you to wherever you want." And so they do. The eagle takes the man on his back. They travel over the ocean and over the earth, and ocean and earth are represented as 3 round objects again. Now there's a whole series of other adventures that occurs, but interestingly, when the hero returns home, his wife is pregnant. So there is again the theme of birth and wanting to live. And I should stress this birth item. We will talk a lot about Gilgamesh, who was seeking immortality in the famous epic. But there are many Mesopotamian stories and other stories derived from it that focus on mortality. And this flying to heaven story, in essence, is also about trying not only to find this earth, but also to transcend the limits set to human existence. That is what Gilgamesh wants to do, and that is also what this Eterna wants to do. You're now listening to a composition of Heitor Villa-Lobos, a Brazilian artist, composer, which seems strangely apt for this scene. And I should add that when this song was sung in the Netherlands in 1910, there was a whole series of poets who wrote poems about this first performance. And this was because of this first song. They had all kinds of associations, and one of them was indeed flying to heaven, so that's why I picked it. Just another frame.